The distress signal came in at 0300 Galactic Standard Time, crackling through subspace with the kind of desperation that made even hardened Council operators pause at their stations. These were people who'd heard everything: planetary invasions, solar flares wiping out entire systems, rogue AI uprisings. But this transmission was different. You could actually hear the fear bleeding through the static. Admiral Keth of the Altarian Defense Force was practically begging through the transmission, his normally composed voice breaking as he described a Vex-High swarm tearing through his outer colonies. Now, if you've never seen an Altarian, picture a 7-foot-tall bird person with feathers that shimmer like oil on water, and a voice that normally sounds like classical music. These beings had evolved from prey animals, and for over 2,000 years, they'd built their entire civilization around peace, art, and philosophy. The idea of violence was so foreign to them that they literally didn't have words for certain types of weapons in their language. So when Admiral Keth's voice cracked as he spoke, every single being in the council chambers felt their blood run cold. "We need warriors," he said. And you could hear the shame in his voice, the way someone might confess to a terrible crime. "But we also need mercy. Our civilians are scattered across 12 worlds, and we can't tell our own people to abandon them." The translation system struggled with that last part because Altarians had 17 different words for abandon, each one carrying layers of cultural shame that most species couldn't even comprehend. These weren't just refugees we were talking about. These were artists, philosophers, children who'd never seen violence, elderly Altarians whose feathers had gone silver with age and wisdom. The kind of people who would try to negotiate with an asteroid if it was heading toward their planet. The Vex-High, on the other hand, were everything the Altarians weren't. Picture organic nightmares that reproduce by consuming other life forms, creatures that turned warfare into a biological function. They didn't conquer planets. They harvested them. No negotiations, no prisoners, no mercy. Just consumption and expansion, like a cancer with spaceships. The Galactic Council emergency session lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 43 different species debated their options. The Crystalline Collective offered their geometric war forms, but everyone knew they'd treat Altarian civilians like acceptable losses. The hive-minded Zephyrians could match the Vex-High numbers, but they'd never learned to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The proud warrior clans of Rigel Prime volunteered immediately, but their idea of mercy was a quick death. That's when Counselor Vextar of the Silicon Courts raised what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say. "What about the humans?" The chamber fell silent. Humans, those strange bipedal creatures on the third rock of a yellow dwarf star, the ones who'd somehow survived on a planet so hostile that most council members needed full environmental suits just to visit their embassy. Earth wasn't just dangerous, it was absurdly, impossibly deadly. Gravity that would crush most species, an atmosphere that was literally poisonous to half the galaxy, weather patterns that'd kill you in dozens of different ways, and native life forms that treated survival as a competitive sport. But here's the thing about humans. They'd not only survived on this nightmare world, they'd thrived on it. More importantly, they developed something the galaxy had never really seen before: the ability to be absolutely ruthless to enemies while showing infinite compassion to the innocent. Other species were either predators or prey, warriors or pacifists, conquerors or refugees. Humans somehow managed to be all of these things at once, switching between them as easily as changing clothes. The Council had been watching Earth for exactly 73 years since first contact, and the reports were confusing. These humans would risk their lives to save a single injured animal, then turn around and design weapons that could crack planets. They'd spend decades perfecting medicines to save lives, while simultaneously developing ways to end conflicts so efficiently that their enemies would surrender rather than face them. When the vote came in, it was unanimous. They were calling in the humans. Not because they were the strongest. Plenty of species had more firepower. Not because they were the smartest. The Altarians themselves were probably more intellectually advanced. They were calling humans because they were the only species anyone could think of that might actually be able to do what Admiral Keth was asking: show mercy while unleashing hell. The message went out on priority channels, cutting through the layers of bureaucracy that usually slowed galactic communication to a crawl. A simple request sent to a small blue world in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Help us. Nobody really knew what to expect when Earth's response came back just 6 hours later. The entire message was 2 words, transmitted in simple galactic standard. We're coming. But somehow, those 2 words carried more weight than entire fleet manifestos from other species. Because when humans said they were coming, the galaxy had learned to pay attention. Captain Jake Morrison stepped off the transport onto Admiral Kess's flagship, and you could practically feel the temperature drop in the docking bay. Now, understand something about this moment. The Altarians had been preparing for this meeting for 3 days. They'd studied every available file on human physiology, psychology, and military doctrine. They thought they knew what to expect. They were wrong. The Altarians, all 7 feet of them with their elegant feathers and graceful movements that looked like they were constantly dancing, took one look at this compact human with his predator's eyes and unconscious tactical awareness, and realized they might have made a terrible mistake. Morrison wasn't particularly tall by human standards, maybe 5'9", but he moved through that docking bay like he owned it. His eyes never stopped scanning, cataloging exit routes, defensive positions, potential threats. Even standing perfectly still, he radiated the kind of controlled violence that made every Altarian in the room want to back away slowly. But here's what really unsettled them. Morrison's uniform was clean, pressed, professional. No scars visible, no intimidating weapons on display, no theatrical posturing. He looked like he could have been attending a business meeting, except for those eyes. Predator's eyes that missed nothing and calculated everything. You said you needed warriors who could show mercy, Morrison said, his voice carrying that flat, professional tone that combat veterans learn when they've seen too much and live to tell about it. No emotion, no bravado, just facts delivered with surgical precision. Behind him, his team filed out of the transport with movements that made the Altarian's feathers rustle with instinctual unease. Sergeant Lisa Park, a woman who couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds but moved like a dancer with deadly intent. Corporal Tom Bradley, built like a brick wall, but somehow managing to be completely silent as he positioned himself to watch the corridor behind them. And about 40 other humans, each one radiating that same control competence that seemed to fill the docking bay with invisible tension. The thing that really bothered the Altarians wasn't how dangerous these humans looked. It was how normal they looked. No fangs, no claws, no natural armor. They were smaller than most galactic species. Their skin looked fragile, and they didn't even have proper environmental protection for space travel. But watching them move, seeing how they automatically formed defensive positions without any apparent communication, feeling the weight of their attention when they looked at you, it was like being studied by apex predators who were politely pretending to be civilized. Admiral Keth tried to maintain his diplomatic composure despite every evolutionary instinct screaming at him to flee, gestured toward the conference room. His feathers kept shifting colors, something Altarians did when they were nervous, cycling through deep blues and purples that indicated barely controlled panic. Captain Morrison, Keth began, his musical voice only slightly strained, I must explain our situation with complete honesty. We have 12 colony worlds under attack, over 4 million civilian non-combatants scattered across these systems. Our people are artists, philosophers, teachers. They've never seen violence like this. Morrison nodded, listening with complete focus. No interruptions, no questions, just absolute attention. The Vex High, Keth continued, his feathers darkening to almost black. They don't take prisoners. They don't negotiate. They harvest whatever biomass they can find and move on. Our defense forces. He paused, shame coloring his voice. We've never actually fought a war before. We have weapons, but we don't know how to use them without endangering our own people. It was Tom Bradley who spoke next, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone that suggested vast experience with exactly this type of situation. Sir, how much time do we have before they hit the core worlds? 6 days, maybe 7 if we're fortunate, Keth replied. Lisa Park stepped forward, her expression professional but somehow reassuring. Admiral, have your people begun evacuation protocols? We're trying, but our civilians, they don't understand why they need to leave their homes. Some are refusing to go. Others are trying to pack their entire lives into cargo containers. And we can't abandon the ones who won't leave. That's when Morrison spoke again, and what he said would become legendary in Altarian culture, quoted in their history books and taught to their children for generations to come. Sir, we've been practicing that particular balance for about 10,000 years. Leave it to us. The way he said it, no boasting, no false bravado, just quiet confidence backed by millennia of human history, sent a chill through every Altarian in the room, because they suddenly realized what they'd actually call for help. Not just warriors, not just protectors. They'd contacted a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning how to be gentle with the innocent while being absolutely lethal to threats. Morrison turned to his team. Lisa, I want evacuation routes mapped within 2 hours. Tom, start coordinating with their defense forces. I want to know exactly what we're working with. Everyone else, get familiar with Altarian biology and psychology. We're not just fighting for territory here. We're protecting a way of life. And in that moment, Admiral Keth understood that humanity had just declared war on the Vex-High. The first planet Morrison's team hit was New Altair, where the Vex-High had just begun their ground assault. The initial reports from orbit looked grim. Smoke rising from the capital city, communications down across 3 major population centers, and emergency signals broadcasting on every frequency. What the humans saw when they dropped planetside was worse than the report suggested. The Vex-High weren't just attacking military targets. They were systematically destroying everything that made Altarian civilization beautiful. Picture this. Buildings that looked like crystalline trees, growing in perfect harmony with the natural landscape, now reduced to smoking rubble. Art galleries that had taken centuries to curate, their contents scattered and burning. Schools where Altarian children learned philosophy alongside mathematics, now serving as makeshift shelters for terrified families who had nowhere else to go. But what happened next defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare. Lisa Park led a squad to the ruins of the capital city, and if you've been watching from above, you might have thought you were seeing some kind of impossible dance. She moved through the devastation, carrying wounded Altarian children on her back, their tiny forms barely weighing anything compared to the combat gear she usually hauled, while simultaneously coordinating orbital strikes against enemy positions through her comm unit. Delta 7, I need precision fire on grid reference 445 to 229, she'd say into her headset, her voice calm and professional, while gently adjusting the injured Altarian child clinging to her shoulders. Civilian families in the basement 2 blocks south. Danger close protocols in effect. The orbital gunners, human marines stationed on ships above, would acknowledge and deliver strikes so precise they could take out a Vex-High nest without disturbing the flower garden next door. This wasn't the kind of warfare the galaxy was used to seeing. Most species approach conflict like a sledgehammer, destroy everything and sort out later. Humans fought like surgeons with scalpels, cutting out the cancer while leaving healthy tissue untouched. Tom Bradley's story became legend among the Altarians. He spent 16 straight hours in a bombed-out school, holding off 3 waves of Vex-High attackers, while medics evacuated 200 civilian refugees through the back exit. Now, understand what this meant. Tom was essentially alone, maybe 3 other humans with him, facing creatures that had terrorized half the galaxy. The Vex-High attacked in swarms, using their natural weapons and biotech that could melt through most armor. But Tom had something they'd never encountered before, human stubbornness combined with tactical brilliance. He turned that ruined school into a fortress, using overturned desks and collapsed walls to create killing fields. Every shot he fired was calculated, every movement planned 3 steps ahead. When his ammunition ran low, he started using Vex-High weapons against them. When those broke, he rigged improvised explosives from school chemistry supplies. The whole time, he kept talking to the evacuees in broken Altarian, trying to keep them calm. Everything okay, friends? Just keep moving, nice and easy. Uncle Tom's got this handled up here. The Altarians later said they'll never forget the sound of his voice, steady, confident, completely unworried, floating down the hallway while explosions shook the building and alien screeches filled the air. This guy was literally fighting for his life against nightmare creatures, and he sounded like he was coaching a kid's soccer game. The Vex-High had conquered 43 worlds using the same strategy: overwhelming force, total destruction, harvest the survivors. It had worked perfectly every single time, because most species approach warfare as an all-or-nothing proposition. Either you fought with everything you had, which usually meant massive civilian casualties, or you tried to protect civilians, which meant you couldn't fight effectively. They'd never face an enemy that could be absolutely ruthless to combatants while showing infinite patience with civilians. Humans had spent thousands of years perfecting this balance, fighting wars while trying to preserve the very things they were fighting to protect. But the moment that really drove this home was when Admiral Keth found Jake Morrison in what used to be the planetary governor's office. The building had taken a direct hit from Vex-High bioweapons. Half the roof was gone, and plasma burn scarred the elegant Altarian architecture. Morrison was standing in the ruins, cradling an injured Altarian infant against his chest with one arm, while talking his sniper team through a precision shot that would take out a Vex-High command node 2 kilometers away. Wind from the southeast at 15 clicks. Morrison said quietly into his comm, his voice the same flat professional tone he always used. Target is mobile, so lead it by about 2 meters. Civilian structures on either side. One shot, no misses. The baby in his arms was making those soft chirping sounds that injured Altarian infants make when they're in pain and scared. So Morrison started humming, some old Earth lullaby his grandmother had taught him when he was barely older than the alien child he now held. Something about mockingbirds and diamond rings, melody older than spaceflight. The baby stopped crying. Its tiny feathered head nestled against Morrison's tactical vest, and those big Altarian eyes that saw deeper into the color spectrum than human vision could imagine, looked up at him with complete trust. That's when Admiral Keth, watching from the doorway, understood exactly what his people had unleashed. They hadn't just called for help. They'd awakened something the galaxy had never seen before. Warriors who fought not because they loved violence, but because they loved peace too much to let it die. 3 weeks later, the Vex-High learned something that would reshape their entire understanding of warfare, and honestly, it nearly broke their collective minds. For over 2 centuries, these creatures had perfected a simple formula for conquest that had never failed them. Hit fast, hit hard, consume everything. They'd expected to face either savage barbarians who'd slaughter everything in sight, or soft peacekeepers who'd hesitate at crucial moments when decisive action was needed. What they got instead was something their species had no framework for understanding. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came during the Battle of Meridian Station. The Vex-High had cornered about 50 human soldiers in a mining facility along with roughly 300 Altarian civilians, mostly families with young children. Standard Vex-High tactics call for using civilians as shields, forcing the enemy to either sacrifice innocents or surrender. It had worked flawlessly on 43 previous worlds. But these humans did something unprecedented. They split into 2 completely different forces, as if they'd flipped some kind of internal switch. Half the team became the gentlest caregivers you could imagine, shepherding civilians to safety with infinite patience, carrying elderly Altarians who couldn't walk, sharing their own food and water with frightened children. Meanwhile, the other half transformed into something that made seasoned Vex-High warriors question their life choices. These weren't berserkers or mindless killers. They were something far more terrifying, calculated, precise, and absolutely merciless when they needed to be. They moved through Vex-High positions like ghosts, appearing where they were least expected, disappearing before counterattacks could form. Every shot was planned. Every movement had a purpose. Every action served a larger strategy that the Vex-High couldn't decipher. Lisa Park exemplified this duality perfectly. One moment she'd be singing soft lullabies to calm Altarian children during evacuations, her voice gentle and maternal. The next moment she'd be coordinating a tactical strike that would eliminate an entire Vex-High nest without leaving so much as a scorch mark on the civilian shelter next door. The Vex-High started calling her the Singing Death, a title that confused them because they had no cultural context for someone who could embody both nurturing and destruction simultaneously. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to operate on completely alien logic. Human soldiers who'd risk their lives to save a single civilian, then turn around and systematically dismantle an entire Vex-High stronghold with a kind of cold efficiency that made veteran warriors flee in terror. It wasn't the efficiency that scared them. Lots of species were efficient killers. It was the way humans could switch between protecting and destroying without any apparent internal conflict. Tom Bradley became a legend among both species during the siege of New Geneva. For 8 hours, he held a medical station against overwhelming odds while Altarian doctors performed emergency surgery on wounded civilians. The Vexi threw everything they had at that position: bioweapons, swarm tactics, even their prize shock troops. Tom methodically destroyed them all while simultaneously helping coordinate the medical procedures, at one point actually holding in 4 bags steady with one hand, while laying down suppressing fire with the other. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Tom sitting in a chair made from dead Vexi bioarmor, calmly reading a children's story to a group of young Altarians while their parents received medical treatment. The story was in broken Altarian, his pronunciation terrible, but the kids were completely absorbed. Behind him, the evidence of the 8-hour battle looked like a natural disaster had swept through, but the medical station was untouched. Captain Morrison stood in the ruins of the enemy command center 3 weeks after first engagement, surrounded by the bodies of Vexi warriors who died defending their war queens. The final battle had lasted less than 20 minutes once the humans located the command structure. No mercy for combatants. That was the rule. But behind him, human medics worked alongside Altarian doctors, treating wounded civilians with the same urgency they'd shown in combat just hours earlier. The scene perfectly encapsulated what had broken the Vexi psychologically. Humans who could be absolutely ruthless when necessary, then immediately returned to being the most compassionate beings the galaxy had ever seen. It wasn't an act or a strategy. It was just how they operated naturally. The captured Vexi expected execution. It's what they would have done to human prisoners. Instead, they found themselves in detention facilities that looked more like educational camps than prisons. Medical care, recreation time, even basic education programs. Humans who seemed genuinely interested in teaching them mathematics, stellar navigation, and something they call philosophy, the study of how to think about thinking. Your species is confusing. One Vexi commander told Morrison during what humans call an interrogation session, but felt more like a really intense college lecture. We understand predators. We understand prey. We understand parasites and symbionts and everything in between. But you... The creature paused, struggling with concepts its language couldn't properly express. You are all of these things simultaneously. How do you function without losing your minds? Morrison just smiled, that same quiet expression he'd worn when humming lullabies to injured Altarian infants. We've had a lot of practice being human. It's complicated, but honestly, we wouldn't want to be any other way. And that's when the Vexi began to understand that they hadn't just lost a war. They'd encountered something that would change them forever. 6 months after the liberation of the Kepler system, something unprecedented happened in galactic history. Representatives from 47 different species attended the ceremony on New Altair, not because they were required to, not because of treaties or trade agreements, but because they wanted to understand what they'd witnessed. Word had spread across the galaxy about something called the human standard, and everyone wanted to see the species that had changed the rules of warfare forever. The ceremony itself took place in the rebuilt capital city, where Altarian architects had worked alongside human engineers to create something entirely new. The building still had that flowing organic beauty that Altarians were famous for, but now they incorporated human defensive concepts, structures that were both gorgeous and nearly impossible to destroy. It was like the two species had learned from each other, creating architecture that embodied both peace and strength. Admiral Keth stood before a monument that had become the most visited site in the Kepler system. The sculpture depicted a human soldier carrying an Altarian child, but if you looked closely, you could see the details that made it extraordinary. The human's face showed exhaustion, determination, and infinite gentleness all at once. The Altarian child's feathers were carved so delicately they seemed to flutter in an unfelt breeze, and its eyes held complete trust. But surrounding the figures were names, thousands of them, carved in both human script and Altarian flowing text. Every civilian saved, every life preserved, every person who'd lived, because humans had learned to be both protectors and warriors. Behind the monument, the city they died to protect stretched toward the horizon, bustling with life that shouldn't have existed. Children played in parks that had been battlefields. Artists displayed sculptures made from melted Vex-High weapons transformed into symbols of hope. Restaurants served fusion cuisine where human comfort food met Altarian delicacies, creating flavors that neither species could have imagined alone. Captain Morrison, now promoted to Colonial Defense Coordinator, watched from the crowd as Admiral Keth spoke about the humans who'd redefined what strength meant. The Altarian's voice carried across the plaza, translated into dozens of languages for the assembled delegates. But the emotion needed no translation. Strength, Keth said, his feathers shimmering with the deep golds and silvers that Altarians displayed during moments of profound respect, is not the ability to destroy. Any species with fusion weapons can turn planets into dust. Any civilization with enough ships can conquer systems. We learned that true strength is something infinitely more difficult. The wisdom to know when not to destroy. The discipline to show mercy from a position of absolute power. The assembled delegates shifted uncomfortably. Most of them came from species that had built their entire military doctrines around overwhelming force or clever tactics. The idea that restraint could be a form of power was alien to many of them. But then Keth gestured toward a section of the crowd that made everyone pay attention. The Vex-High delegation, former enemies now serving as cultural liaisons. Listen with a kind of attention you only see from people who've had their entire worldview shattered and rebuilt. These weren't the same creatures that had terrorized 43 worlds. 6 months of exposure to human philosophy, combined with educational programs that treated them as individuals rather than monsters, had transformed them into something the galaxy had never seen before. Their leader, a former war commander named Zexthal, had learned to speak perfect galactic standard and had even picked up some human idioms. When reporters asked him about the transformation, he said something that became quoted in diplomatic circles for years afterward. Humans taught us that being the strongest doesn't mean you have to use all your strength. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose not to hurt someone when you easily could. As the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, Morrison felt his communication device buzz with an incoming priority message from Earth Command. The text was brief but comprehensive. Requests were flooding in from across the galaxy. The Nexarian Trade Federation needed help with pirates who were using civilian cargo ships as human shields. The Crystal Collective had a rebellion problem, where the rebels were hiding in population centers. The Outer Rim territories had a situation involving slavers who embedded themselves in refugee camps. Every single request had the same theme. They needed someone who could fight without becoming the monster they were fighting against. Morrison scrolled through the list, recognizing the pattern. These weren't military problems that could be solved with bigger guns or more ships. These were human problems. Situations that require the kind of moral flexibility that a species had spent millennia developing. The ability to be gentle with victims while being absolutely ruthless with victimizers. The wisdom to know the difference between the two, even when they were standing right next to each other. Lisa Park appeared at his shoulder, reading over the messages. "Looks like we're going to be busy," she said with that dry humor that had kept their team sane through the worst days of the Kepler campaign. Tom Bradley joined them, carrying his gear bag over one shoulder and humming something that might have been an Altarian folk song he'd picked up from the kids he protected. "Where to next, boss?" Morrison looked up at the alien sky, where 3 different moons were rising over a city that shouldn't have existed, filled with people who should have been dead. He thought about his grandmother's lullabies, about the weight of carrying wounded children through burning cities, about Tom reading stories to scare kids while explosions shook the building around them, about Lisa coordinating orbital strikes while changing an infant's diaper. He typed his response to Earth Command, the same 2 words that had started this whole adventure. "We're coming." Because that's what humans do. When the galaxy asked for mercy, Earth sent its Deathworlders, the only species crazy enough to master both destruction and compassion, and wise enough to know when to use each one.